We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
I was asked by Greg about, I don't know, 8 days ago or so, if I could do anything Friday morning. I said, okay, I can come up with something. And what I started thinking about is things I've been thinking about on the trip anyway, but it also has factored into several conversations that I've had along the way. So if you hear something that sounds vaguely familiar, it is. I'm calling this Mediated, Unmediated, subtitled Recovering Reality, if you're taking notes or anything. So the first thought that I have is that we live in a very mediated world. What do I mean by mediated? I am using Marshall McLuhan's definition of media. Marshall McLuhan, back in the 60s, came up with an idea of what the media was, and his basic thought was that the media is the thing that stands between us and the other, the thing being mediated with. So his idea of what media was is that it is anything that we have created that comes between us and something else. So a light bulb is a media, and writing is a media, a medium. Sorry, to use the proper phrase. They are things. Language itself is a medium. It is a medium we have for dealing with the outside world. It is, one could argue that, for instance, language, physical touch, things like that, smell, your basic senses, are the least mediated things we have because we are using our organs. But of course, we all know of situations where organs can get damaged. I have a friend back in Alaska who contracted a disease which knocked out her sense of smell. So when it comes to her ability to sense smell, she no longer does that. She also feels really fine to go out and kind of clean up the dog mess. So that's one of the benefits of it. But of course she really wants her sense of smell back because that is one of the ways she perceives the world. But once you get beyond that, then we start making inventions. The wheel, when you put it on a cart, helps to mediate us. And one of the things that McLuhan stressed was, and I think he was right in this, is that the media are also an exchange. So we're exchanging something for another thing. So in the wheel, what are we exchanging? Our feet. Getting on the road, we no longer have to walk. We can now get on the cart and ride. Of course, there are other uses for the wheel. But the light bulb exchanges something like daylight. We can now extend daylight. And in many places, it becomes a substitute for daylight. And so, in a sense, you can get rid of daylight in a certain way by the light bulb. Of course, television is what we often think of when we go to media, film, all of that sort of thing. But my feeling is, and this is what I've seen in my travels, is that we are probably living in the most mediated age imaginable thus far. And what do I mean? This is what I mean. I'm going to like Hallstatt, Austria, which is just as beautiful as this, more so because it's on a pristine lake, surrounded by mountains, beautiful medieval village, a Baroque medieval village on the side of a hill. You get there by boat. Absolutely, absolutely beautiful. When I first visited there 3 years ago, I was surprised. I spent 3 days there. Everyone else I was meeting was spending one night there and leaving. Now, there were people spending a night, but now they seem to be coming for the afternoon and leaving by the 6 o'clock boat, which is the last boat going across. And I thought, that's really weird. But then I started to bump into the people that I was seeing and that were visiting the place. I mean, they'd read about it in guidebooks and such. I happened to be staying in a little pension that was like right on the edge of the lake. I overheard someone say, but there's nothing to do here. Most of the people in my pension were Asians of some sort, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans. And I would go downstairs, and various people would just be sitting there doing this. Just, you know, the iPhone, just playing with it. Now I thought, well, what about this place you're in? Does that matter? They were there for hours. I mean, they had obviously serious stuff to do. I don't know what it was. I decided, okay, I'd walked around during the day, done various things, but I decided it was evening, nice quiet town. I'm going to go outside, full moon on the lake, with clouds kind of creating this kind of halo effect around the moon. And it was, you know, like this empty medieval Baroque village with like this one church that has all these skulls lined up in it right next to the graveyard, which overlooks the lake. I mean, just amazing stuff. So I decided I'd go out there and just walk around. I brought my camera with me and started to take a few photos, and I thought, like, I have to do that. I can't do this right now because I don't really understand it. I'll come back tomorrow after I've spent more time here. But it was an amazing experience. But as I was walking out, one of them said to me, "You're leaving? Like, there's nothing to do out there. What are you going to do?" And I thought, how strange. But I kept seeing this everywhere. It's not just Asians in Hallstatt. It's like people, like where I work in Alaska. Where I live in Alaska is frankly spectacular. We get one cruise ship a week that shows up where we live. And for me, that's plenty. There's a town 13 miles away by water, 260 miles away by road, called Skagway, which gets 5 cruise ships a week. A day. There's only 700 people that live in the town. 10,000 people show up there. They get an extra 2,000 summer workers there. So some people say it's kind of like a college dormitory situation without a college. You get all these like 20-something people working there. We prefer Haynes, actually, to give you a little inside scoop here. They say that there's a love-hate relationship between Haynes and Skagway. Skagway loves Haynes. Haynes hates Skagway. We call it Disneyland. And in fact, the Disney cruise ships have come there. So, but in our town, we get 1 cruise ship a day. And this is what I've seen. I work in the summers as a bus driver, and I also work on the river, getting people into rafts and hopefully getting them out of the water, which is the tougher part. This is what I've seen as people are walking off the gangplank, or off the pier. Just, again, the exact same like mystical communion with their technology, this iPhone and iPads and everything else. They're just sitting there, just doing that. As they're walking, I'm sitting there saying, "Hello, look around you. Do you think you'll ever get here again?" No, they won't, probably. Many of them won't. And yet, nevertheless, the little gizmo in their hand is far more fascinating, far more involving than the natural world. And in fact, that's true. That is to say, the reason why technology, and it's all of us, fess up, we all get sucked into this stuff. I mean, we've all had that experience of like, where did that 6 hours go? I was just sitting here and suddenly it's gone. We all have to spend so much time looking at screens, which completely mediates between us and the world around us. And so one of the things I thought I would do today is talk about, not so much about media, I want to talk a little bit more about that, but really about how to kind of break the spell, how to get areas of, what Jacques Ellul calls how to install freedom in the cracks that the system leaves behind, because it does leave cracks. And one thing, speaking of Jacques Ellul, he has a very interesting, in his book, The Technological System, which is the the second of 3 books he wrote on technology, all of which I recommended, he discusses the concept of environments. And he says, originally humans were in the natural environment. That is, nature was predominant in the world we lived. But, well, of course, nature provides many good things. It provides the sunshine that makes plants grow. It provides the oxygen. It provides, the soil we need. All of these things. But it is not a neutral environment. It also has many dangers associated with it. So, the danger of floods, the danger of drought, the danger of wild animals, the danger of insects that cause all sorts of diseases and things like that. And one can go on thinking about the dangers in nature versus the benefits. Well, of course, some of those dangers are quite bad. So he then says eventually human beings created the second environment, which is the social world. And the social world is typified by the city. It includes agriculture. It includes a world where we have more control over the natural world. It is, in a sense, a world that human beings have made to have control over all of those variables in the natural world that can be so unpredictable. Of course, it doesn't always work. There still are floods. But we'll make levees on the side of the river. We'll try to control them. And people have done quite a bit to control nature. So much so, it is often said that God is sometimes speaking to us in nature. And what I used to say to my friends in New York is, well, if God was speaking to you in nature, how would you know? When was the last time you were actually in nature? I mean, even if you're here right now, you're not in nature. You're in a room that we have constructed, part of the megapolis of Villar that is expanding above us. I just realized that yesterday, that Villar is going to be this one massive thing eventually. But in fact, that time spent actually in nature has dwindled radically for people. I know this because I chose to leave New York City and to go to Alaska, where if I want to have a very natural experience, I can walk about 100 yards or meters off the road and anywhere, and within that 100 meters, I can start to feel things I will never feel anywhere else. And one of the reasons for that is because you start to have to pay attention to everything around you very seriously. One of the things you're paying attention to mostly is the sounds. And the reason for that is because you don't want to hear the following sound. Because we have very, very large animals in our valley, including a bear, I think I've told some of you this, that is as tall as I am right now, is sitting down. I saw that once. With ears going across from ear to ear, the head was that big. Now that animal, if it was to stand on its hind legs, would be quite tall. Maybe, at least, another 2/3 of me, above me. So you have to pay attention to what you're doing. Also, actually, the moose are much more dangerous, and they are just as big. So just those two animals alone cause you to very much, I call it bear fear, but I think it's a really good thing because you need to have utmost respect for them and understand them in order to live in our environment. So you don't go out with perfumes. You don't go out, you don't go cooking bacon somewhere. Once you realize that a bear can smell like 2 miles, 5 miles away or whatever, you just say, okay, I have to change myself to be here. That's the natural world. We don't live in that. We moved into the cities, the urban environments, suburban environments, to be around people because there's safety there. But that environment is not neutral either. And so there are all sorts of dangers. Well, on one hand, we get to stockpile our food together. We get to have the community of people together. We get to create art together. We get to create civilizations together. Fantastic stuff. We also get to fight each other. We also get to have wars. We also have all the problems involved with sexuality and love. We also have these massive kind of like groupthink cults emerging, all sorts of dangers connected to us being together. And in fact, if one looks at the World War II, one can understand just how wild the human environment can be. And it can get pretty dark. I mean, if anyone thinks, I've met a couple of people in my life who, in Alaska even, who said things like, there's no such thing as evil, it's just the way we think. And I was just like, I would like to just throw you down in the middle of certain environments in World War II and say, really? There's nothing evil going on here? It's tough. I mean, it's all connected. So, obviously, Ellul says, then we had to create another environment to help us with that. And that environment is technology. So, and he starts with technology as not just machines and things, but as techniques as well. So, and in fact, one could say one of the most powerful bits of technology is the clock, because it organizes our time so well. Basically, he said, we no longer actually live so much even in the social realm. We now live in the technological realm. Nearly everything we do is mediated by technology. So your friendships are all mediated by technology. Telephones, internet, light bulbs at night even to keep you talking. And the way we work is all mediated by technology. You know, we have to go to work at certain times because technology works better when people arrive at certain times. So much of our environment is now based upon technology, so much so that we could say technology has become the new environment for humanity. But technology, which has provided many things. I am in contact, for instance, before I took this trip, I could contact people in the Czech Republic, come, meet them, through them, have an interview with a famous Czech puppeteer. Wow, that is really exciting. You know, think of all the technology that got you here today. The airplanes, the internet connections to buy tickets. In fact, many people feel comfortable traveling today because they have their cell phone or their laptop, and then they can send messages back. They can feel somehow connected back to home. And so technology is in everything we do now. It is our environment. And of course it sits upon the other two environments. It is hosted by them. But it is a bit of a parasite as well. But many people are, you know, technophiles. Ellul even goes as far as saying technophages, which would be technology eaters. And he says every time he brings up any questions about technology, he's always accused of being a technophobe or a Luddite or something. There's no going back. We're not like losing technology anytime tomorrow. So the question is, it's not just neutral. And there are many, many dangers involved with it as well. For instance, consider the car. There's another French writer, similar to Ellul in many ways, Paul Virilio, who writes that the invention of the car was also the invention of the car accident. More people die in America of car accidents than, you know, wild animals, that's for sure, than almost anything else. I mean, if you're going to see death in America, you're probably not going to see someone dying in a hospital. You're probably going to see them on the side of the road in an upturned car. So the car is also the invention of the car accident. Likewise, our newer technology of all the things related to the internet, the computer, and now, you know, social networking and things have their dangers associated with them. And among those dangers, probably there are things we don't know yet at all. I mean, we are still, you might say, with regards to computer, internet technology, social networking, wireless technology, all of these things, we are probably in the 1930s as far as cars go. We haven't seen yet the real invention of the superhighway. The highway, as in America, when they started really building the massive roads, or in Europe, the Autobahn. These things changed everything. We haven't seen yet really what the effects of pollution are in terms of the computer. We're just getting glimpses of it. And we're a little aware of it because we know our other technology. But still, we haven't arrived at the point where we really understand the dangers yet. We're still like kind of getting a glimpse of it. It's like, yeah, it's not good to be run over by a car phase. One of the things I'm convinced that technology is doing is separating us, not bringing us together. Yes, you can communicate with all sorts of people, but the very fact that we can move and take our little devices with us and feel somehow connected to people back home gives us the illusion that we're still somehow there. Gives us the illusion that we can all meet, become Facebook friends, and that somehow we will stay close. And it's a bit of an illusion. The only way to get around that illusion is to put some reality on it. And so that's what I want to discuss. One more thing about mediation before we discuss some other things here is there are degrees of mediation. So consider the writing of Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Herman Melville went to sea and, using the mediation of language, paper, and eventually a book, wrote Moby Dick. So basically there isn't much. There's basically him writing and a book, and there it is. 3 degrees so between him and the original experiences that inspired him. Let's take another example. So somebody reads Moby Dick and then decides to make like a little adventure story of it. And then someone else says, no, we can do this in movies. We'll call them serials. And they used to have these serials in the 1930s through 50s where they would have kids would come and they would see a chapter each week. So you had to keep coming back on Saturdays to watch your little serials when you were a kid. It's pre-television. So they would have these adventure serials like Jungle Jim. And, there would be like different kinds of adventures on the Congo and, Tarzan and all of this sort of thing. Well, some kids watched that when they were growing up and then decided, hey, we can do something like that. Someone like George Lucas or Steven Spielberg, of which Raiders of the Lost Ark and Star Wars are both completely based on serials. But what they're not based on is any direct experience, certainly not of the adventurous life, living on the ocean, living, actual archaeological expeditions, this sort of thing. Steven Spielberg has none of that. So he makes a movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, with George Lucas. And of course it becomes a big box office hit. They make things like puzzles and games out of it. So you can play the board game of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Another degree of mediation from the original concept of, say, a life lived in the ocean or as an archaeologist or something like that. But then time goes on. Oh yeah, it becomes a videotape, a VHS, eventually a DVD. It also shows up on television. More degrees of mediation. But now they make like a new version a few years back, number 4, which was kind of superfluous, but there you go. And then there are more degrees. Now you can play the video game. And what is a review on the internet that's about a paragraph long, if that, of the video game, saying something like, it's cool, but it sucks? Basically that kind of language. What is that review in relationship all the way back to actual living in some sort of dangerous environment? I would argue there is almost no relationship anymore. It's so far away. But that is the world we live in. I mean, I have heard people having endless discussions about video games or endless discussions about, television series and such. And you come to realize that they are so abstract. But then how abstract is the behavior of sitting with your iPhone? I mean, I started to think to myself, the people that I was running into, whether in Prague or Warsaw or whatever, and you see this behavior everywhere. It's like, to me, this is humanity circa 2012. And I start to say, well, where are these people? That is to say, where physically, geographically are they? Are they here or are they there? And what's there? You see, we've become so abstract in what we do for living. As I'm walking through these massive shopping malls in like Krakow or Warsaw or Berlin or Prague, I am asking myself where I am too. Am I in America? The degree of mediation involved in a shopping mall is also quite abstract. So Jacques Ellul, at the end of his book, the 3rd book on technology, which he wrote closer to his death in 87, I think, said, what should we do? Are we hopelessly trapped by this technology? Can we do anything? He says, no, not if you think you've got like some sort of magic power to deal with it. Not if you think you can start a movement to do it. I'm paraphrasing. But he does say, but what we have to remember is so far we have no example of a system which does not eventually wear down. We have also no example of a system which is perfect. And technology, while it completely surrounds us, leaves cracks behind. There are all sorts of cracks. L'Abri is kind of a crack of technology. That is to say, it hasn't quite dealt with L'Abri. L'Abri still operates in very kind of like funky, old-school ways in many ways. In those cracks, he says, there we must install a kind of precious freedom. And the crack may not last. That is to say, it may get finally dealt with by the machinery around us. But there is where he says we must install the crack, something in that. So, some of the places where we still have freedom are places like our own choices of meals, how we have conversation, things we do in our working environment, things we do in our playtime, in our recreation time. We have freedom there. Not to say that you can't totally bring technology into all those environments and change the nature of them. But what I'd like to do right now is just give you some very practical advice. And this is, I would say, things that I've been thinking about since I was first at L'Abri in 1978. Because I think I saw things when I was first at L'Abri, including the discussions at mealtimes, that struck me as like, yeah, that's human. I have to find a way to continue that somehow. And those are the kind of things I want to talk about now. It's just human, basic things. These are not particularly spectacular in any sort of way. I just wrote these thoughts down kind of randomly, just to cover things. There's a lot more I could say. You'll have your own ideas and suggestions, and I ask you to think about it in your own lives. What can you do to, in a sense, strengthen the things that remain, to bring humanity in situations where it just seems like the chaos of the noise of our society is just impinging upon us all. One principle is this: what used to seem natural now must be done by choice. And what do I mean by that? People used to get together and very naturally sing songs. For instance, during the celebration of a harvest, they would have a dance, they would have a feast, they would have a get-together. We do not do that in our society. Yeah, we have Christmas, yeah, we have Thanksgiving or Victoria Day. What is Victoria Day? That is the celebration of Queen Victoria, isn't it? Yeah. Yes. Okay, but do you have a special feast for that? Is there anything that goes with that?
Parade.
It's a parade. Okay, well, a parade's a nice thing. But what is, whatever your society is, there's been various celebrations and moments related to it. But like I say, people used to sing together. People used to tell stories to each other. People used to, the art that people made used to go back into the church or into their living environment in a certain way. Now, in order to do those things, you have to really think about it. You have to really choose to do it, because it is not going to happen in most cases. I mean, there are communities where some things do happen, and thankfully, in Alaska, we do have a few things that continue. And in some cultures, like the Irish, are still very good at conversation, and they still have quite a bit of folk music that is played not for tourists, but for themselves. And a culture like Georgia, over in the Caucasian mountains, is excellent at these things, because they almost define themselves by how much they dance and how much they sing, and their ability to have feasts and to toast each other. And the toasting is like poetry, and hospitality is an art form, And yet, at the same time, if you go there, you're going to find the same kinds of things in their society, probably to a less advanced degree, but nevertheless, you're going to find all the pop culture stuff that you find anywhere else. You're going to find everyone wanting the technology or having various bits of the technology that you find everywhere else. And yet, because of their definition of themselves being that hard, so all the kids in school in Georgia have 2 hours of dance class afterwards for which they can learn their dances. And they don't do them for the tourists. They do them for themselves. And so I've found YouTube videos of kids just breaking spontaneously into practicing their dance moves, like out in the parking lot. Find that in the same way in the States. Not so much. I mean, it just doesn't quite happen like that. Or I doubt in most places in Europe, certainly in the western part. But basically, it revolves around, the things I'm talking about revolve around daily life. And I think one of the key ingredients here to make any of this work is settling down. That is to say, we live in a time where so many people, particularly younger people, are always talking about, we need to do this for the ecology and we need to do that for the environment and such. To which I'm saying, great, we do need to do things. You know, we can discuss what's too much and what's not enough and all of those things, but nevertheless, something needs to be done. However, we also are living in the exact same moment when people, I have met, living in Alaska, I've met so many people, say 30 and under, who are just like semi-nomadic. They just work for 6 months here, go to 6 months somewhere else. They'll work, make money in Alaska, go to Thailand or Costa Rica. Maybe they'll work doing skiing for 1 year, they'll be a few years in Alaska, now they're working in Utah. I mean, now that's not everybody, but that's a bunch of people. I mean, I'm surprised by how many people I find living this kind of weird semi-nomadic existence where they're here for a while and there for a while. But here is the facts. You can't really care for the earth until you have a specific geographical spot to care for. Because prior to that, again, it's all abstraction and largely propaganda. So you have to have something to hold on to. You have to go out and try to plant something in the ground. You have to try to care about what the actual local environment is and the issues that you have. And without that, everything ends up being stuff you're skimming through online. So I'm saying this is something. Now, I'm not saying you have to go settle down now, but I'm saying this should be a goal. Where are you going to end up? Now, of course, the problem is, what if you end up in, I don't know, the outskirts of Sacramento, California, you know, the halfway down the Bay Area in California, you know, suburbs of Dallas. That's a tough environment to care about because we've created these environments basically around another piece of technology, our car. And so they are very difficult environments to care for. One of the reasons I'm in Alaska is because it's not an environment created around the car. We are, in fact, more like walled in against it, the natural world. And so we have to protect ourselves. And there's also, we're always talking about the weather and always talking about the animals. Basically, in the summer it's the bears and in the winter it's the ice and snow. Those are, you can talk about those things with anybody, anytime. You'd be surprised how much you can learn about all the plants and animals and the soil and the rocks and the mountains and the rivers and the oceans and the beaches and all of this stuff. However, if you live in New York City, all you've got is Central Park. It's a little tough, although I must say, having lived in New York City for 16 years, I love the place. And I feel a definite connection to there. And the only reason I didn't stay there the rest of my life wasn't because I hated it, but because I just had this feeling that probably wasn't the best place to age in. And I wanted to be somewhere where there was a sense of community. We need time for unmediated activities. That is, say, or shall we say, less mediated activities. And this includes gardening, an excellent thing to do. I find nothing wrong with gardening except weeds and bugs and things like that. But as far as gardening as an activity, nothing I think connects you probably more seriously to your environment than trying to grow anything in it. Because you start, you're just touching the dirt, touching the earth. You're no longer, you can't possibly, I mean, yeah, you could kind of plug in and listen to music while you do it, which, as a sub-note, try walking around without something in your ears. Particularly around here, it's a nice environment for it. You know, try not to see everything with a soundtrack. I love music, I love recorded music. I am sure, more of it than all of you put together. But I would also say, like last time I came to Europe, someone said, so are you taking your music with you? To which I said, I don't have any music. I have recordings. No, I'm not taking that. I'm just going. You know. And then what I do is I go and look specifically for new CDs and stuff as I travel. And I start to listen to them a little bit as I travel if I can. And it kind of plugs into, in some way, the connection I have with my trip itself. So I try to be present where I am rather than to create a technological environment for myself. And obviously the CDs don't even matter as much as where I am. So I don't walk around with anything but the noise of the environment. So I heard lots more building noises in Villar now than I ever heard before. And I take that into account. That's part of my experience. I went, they are doing an awful lot of building up there. I wonder what that's about. I think about it. because I hear all that sound. I hear the sound of big trucks going by. I don't block it out and live in my soundtrack. So gardening is one of those things that it roots you. Now, you can do it any way you want. There's nothing wrong with listening to music while you're doing it. But you have to think about what I'm saying is to become conscious of how much you use these things and what they mean. Having animals. And I'm not just talking pets here, although pets are nice too. And even there, I think people tend to romanticize their relationship to pets. But animals, chickens, cows, these kinds of things. You know, if you have an environment in which these things have any meaning, and I'm lucky in Alaska, my animals are in the river and in the mountains. And I have to understand them to live there. So I have to understand salmon in order to eat them. And I have to understand bears in order to not be eaten. People say, well, do you guys have problems with bears? I mean, I've been there 16 years. No one's been attacked by a bear, except for one hunter I can think of who accidentally shot a bear, wounded it, and then went after it. And then the bear turned around, and that's the worst of all situations. But basically, we all have a pretty good understanding of what shall you call it, bear psychology. We also have an understanding of moose psychology, to which the answer is there is none. They are much stupider animals. You can argue, you can kind of reason with a bear like you can with a dog. You cannot reason with a moose any more than you can with a cow. You know, they're just kind of dense. And they have huge, huge antlers that can be like that far across, you know, so they're massive. But getting in touch with animals is amazing. Even walking around here, I'm reminded just listening to just smelling the cow scent everywhere, the cow manure scent. It's just like, it's a specific kind of Swiss cow manure scent. I'm back and there's the tinkling of the bells and, you know, it all works together. And again, using your senses to understand things. Eating. Eating is something I think we don't understand at all. I think we're losing our connection to it. And what I mean is that when a person is sitting in front of, say, television screen, watching a DVD, maybe, and they're eating some pre-made, pre-processed food, they have reduced the act of eating to perhaps the most abstract level imaginable. I mean, the only thing that could probably be more abstract is if they had an IV tube. Eating starts with putting the first seed in the ground and ends with the compost pile. You know, eating involves the animals giving birth. It involves pulling the fish out of the river. It involves an entire process that starts. So eating and meals isn't just this one act of sitting down at the table. It starts with first finding the food or buying the food, learning to recognize good food, taking whatever money you can, making it stretch, or doing something wise with it. Then, what shall you cook? Shall you just go into the kitchen randomly and just start cooking without any training? No. It helps if someone shows you a few basic cooking techniques. Otherwise, most of it, as a friend of mine, who actually was a Labrie student for a while, came up to Alaska and visited me, and she had trouble with toast. But nevertheless, to get beyond that, she's actually a better cook now because she's thought about it and learned to cook. But then there's all the preparation for cooking, as you probably learn when you're working in the kitchen around here. There then is the actual mealtime itself, which we'll get to. We'll discuss that more in a bit because it's more than just sitting and eating. And then there is, after the meal, washing, cleaning, making sure that the garbage is dealt with in different sorts of ways. And so it's an entire holistic process. It starts way over here and goes way over here. And ultimately the compost should be taken out and put in the, you know, and it should become dirt again or something like that. In this context, I think family becomes very important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time thinking about it, but how one deals with these things in each individual family is very different. Work becomes very important. And I would say we often have jobs that involve this. You know, just typing, staring into a screen, you know, losing certain aspects of our eyesight by doing so. But I would say, if you can find other things to do with your hands, that's a good thing. Because again, it's touching. I think that's one of the reasons why puppetry is such an interesting thing, is because it really involves a tactility. And our world, again, is putting us in front of the screen in every possible way, causing us to live in a kind of virtual means. But I think that, you know, we need to have outlets for our physical sensations, particularly touch. And work is one of those things. And to get blisters in your hands or feet or whatever is not a bad thing. It does require some treatment and, you know, to get beyond a certain point, but it's not a bad thing. Likewise with art. I have nothing against people making art on computer screens. I do it myself. But I would also say that the physical components to art are also probably more important. And even those things that are made in digital means need to find some sort of much more communal expression in their final product, to go back into the community. I'll talk about that a little bit in a couple seconds. So the next point here is, besides daily life, conversation and relationships. And I would say, yeah, well, doesn't everyone know how to talk? I mean, it's like, you know, once you learn the language, everyone can talk. Yes, but technology can often get in the way. I've got a few, like, personal rules. Let's say I'm watching something on television, and I hear this on my back door. By the time the person has opened the door, which they often do in Alaska, they kind of like knock and open at the same time, they don't even know that I was watching anything. And, you know, that's most of the time. Sometimes I actually don't get there quite in time. But I would say like 99 times out of 100, I'm just like, the whole thing's off. Why? Because I want them to understand that they are more important than whatever I was doing. Because nothing I'm doing on a screen is more important than a conversation with a human being. Except, of course, in moments where you really have work to do, and you must have this deadline, and if you don't do it, you're in deep doo-doo. And in that case, I would still turn it off, and then go up to them and explain, I've really got to finish working on this project. And, you know, but apart from that, whatever they come through the door with, they are number one. This can wait. I can watch it anytime. I can finish it anytime. I can turn my computer off and come back to it anytime. But the person is different. And they may have something very interesting to talk about. Or they may just want to drop by and ask a simple question. But whatever it is, people are more important than our things. So I always put them first. Likewise, if I have a group of people over and someone calls on my phone, I still have a landline. I must confess. I'm actually going around with a cell phone right now, and it's like old school cell phone that just does calls. I picked it up in Europe, but the nice thing is the European cell phone won't work in America. As soon as I get to America, wham, back into the drawer. I am on the landline. Good luck finding me. I am not immediately at your disposal. I live actually in the world where people are actually distant from each other, so good luck. You know, and that's my feeling. It's like, why should we have these like micro conversations all the time? Why not have real conversations? But like if I have people over and someone calls on the phone, yeah, I have to answer the phone. It's kind of being insistent. But I pick it up and as soon as possible, get off. Because again, they aren't as important as the people actually in my presence. Now, of course, there could be an emergency or something like that. That's a different situation. But as far as people go, people are more important than things. The telephone is a thing. Yes, there's a voice on the end, and McLuhan says that it calls you. But I try to keep that as a rule. These sorts of things, and I would say the same with your various pads and pods and everything else, is that to try to get them under control so they don't... I mean, I think a lot of bad behavior is bred in college dormitories where people are just kind of sitting around, kind of alienated from each other, just kind of like, yeah, I'm doing this. Oh, check this out on this. And, you know. But the thing is, that sort of behavior doesn't actually wash in the end when you have actual human relationships to take care of. Because, you know, in a family, the husband and the wife, and they're trying to talk to each other, but meanwhile, the television or the computer are just like running and kind of a constant distraction. It doesn't help the conversation. It doesn't do anything. And so for me, the conversation is pretty much the primary thing we're here for as human beings, that God has put us here. Think about it. In the beginning was the Word. What's the Word suggest? It suggests a conversation already. It suggests dialogue. It suggests relationship already from the beginning. My physical human relationship with you is where I'm going to, again, as in nature, see something of God in that dialogue. So I need to have that. That's not like optional. So again, conversation becomes primary. And it becomes primary in eating. And this is one thing I said I'd get back to. So eating is not just about food. It is also one of the central places we have for conversation. Now, of course, not every meal can be a formal L'Abri meal, you know. And when you go back, you're going to find people that aren't quite as eager to discuss some of these things at mealtime than you are. And you have to just live with that and find other things to talk about. And it can be tough sometimes because you really you get used to this sort of thing and you're like, oh boy, what are we going to talk about today? Or as sometimes you get the uncomfortable silence for 20 minutes waiting for someone to like, say something, please. One of the things we can do is use our imaginations, use our creativity to find ways to breed situations where conversation happens at meals. And I think one of the best places to start, not that every meal has to be like I said, no, it's not always a formal conversation or anything like that. In fact, most of your meal conversations won't be. I do it by having special dinners for people. And I find this really practical. And I've learned some things about dinners and how to give them that I find very helpful. Sometimes people confuse what I'm saying with these kind of theme dinners, like we're going to have a Hawaiian dinner, or we're going to have a Mexican meal or a Thai meal or whatever. Yeah, that's fine. But that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something that is actually much more to a point, and the point is human relationships. One of the things I remember that really started me thinking about what makes an interesting meal, or as I often call them, feasts. And I say that because if you say, we're having a party at our house, why don't you come over? We're having a party. Immediately, connotations form around that word party. And a lot of those connotations are like, yeah, we're going to have a party. The party just suggests certain things. In fact, I had a bunch of, I work with guides on the river in Alaska who rowing and stuff. And they can be kind of rowdy at times. So, the first time, then they were all like, Byrne, invite us over to your house, because it's kind of a special place. So I said, okay, but you're going to have to follow my rules in my house. They were like, okay. So when they came in, I had various pieces of paper set out for them. We give everyone, before they get on the rafts, a release form. I had them sign release forms. And the top of the release form says, by signing this, you are agreeing that you are not at a party, you are at a dinner. And by party, that includes all the words that can include. If you feel like continuing your party, if you feel that that is what you really want, there are many institutions in this town that will serve you, or other places to go. But if you're here for dinner. And they all remember that years later. They always was like, yeah, you made us sign release forms to get into his house, which was great. That was part of the conversation. That was like, what I was doing was creating a little bit of an artwork, which of course I saved that, having everyone's signatures on it. What a great little memento for me. But I purposely did that in order to, and I've done other things like this, very purposeful, in order to start them being in a different environment. Because I find that environments can be very telling. That's why a college environment is usually a bad place for this sort of thing, because everyone knows how they're supposed to react. And what I like to do is throw people off so they don't know, because that's when they start acting more like themselves rather than themselves. The quote of themselves. So I remember, I think I've mentioned to a few of you, I was in these Jesus People communes when I was younger. And one time we went to this kind of Godstock thing. It was kind of a Woodstock for Christians. While we were there were like people from all these different ministries up and down the West Coast were there. And we were sitting, eating lunch. We had a little blessing over to Jesus, thank you for this food, etc. And meanwhile, there was another group over there who were just like singing and shouting and saying, Jesus, thank you for this food. And maybe they were a little more charismatic than we were. But a friend of mine looks over there. He's a little more cynical than I was at that time. And he says, well, no wonder they're praising God so much. Look what they're eating. And they had dug a pit, had a roast lamb turning on it. And we looked at our food and we had hot dogs. And something lodged in my mind at that time. It's like, yeah, the lamb in the pit. That's what it's about. When you get together, something a little different, something special. That's what makes it interesting. That's where it's kind of like coming to L'Abri. Before you actually meet all the students and figure out who your tutors are and all that, you're smashed in the face with that stuff out there, the mountains and the bus ride up, and you're sitting there going like, huh, this is different, which throws you off and opens you up to start thinking about different things. But it's the same with, I've discovered, having a meal with food. So, some of the objects that have shown up on my special meals, of course, if I ever get L'Abri people over there, even though we never have fondue at L'Abri, but you might have it around Switzerland, we always have fondue, and everyone starts talking about Switzerland and L'Abri. It's just one of these weird things. Also, chocolate, Swiss chocolate can kind of set off those kinds of conversations. But that's L'Abri people. They're a separate species. I've had the following kinds of things. I've had... let's see. I did make an attempt at steak and kidney pie once, but I've had goat, lamb, rabbit. Let's see. And then, of course, the more exotic things like moose, bear sausage. You know, when we get our first fish of the year, we start having these massive cookouts and stuff, and you have fresh fish, which is nothing like the thing called salmon over here, which we won't get into the idea of farm salmon, but all I can say is that the wild Alaskan salmon, eaten the day that it's brought in, there's just absolutely no comparison to any other thing. But also, just one of the things I often do is around Christmas time, I will have an item on the menu that makes everyone kind of go, huh, the first time, and it's snails. And the reason I do that is because actually, the first time I ever had snails was that there used to be a place, French L'Abri, that Juanita was in charge of years ago. And she had snails around Christmas time. And ever since then, I've always associated snails with Christmas. And evidently, the French do too. So I always bring that out. And of course, you remember when you eat something that's like off your radar. You know, it's like normally we're eating the same kinds of things over and over. And then someone throws in, wham! Here's someone walked in once to my house with an entire deer and said, "Do you want this?" I said, "Yeah." So he says, "Well, you got to hang it to dry for to cure for a week first." I said, "Okay." It was pretty amazing. It's like, first of all, now you're having a very interesting conversation about food, because the food on your table is inspiring something. And it can be done in lots and lots and lots of different ways. I went over to someone's house once, and they were Japanese. They were having sushi. They were not having sushi the way Americans have sushi. The Americans have sushi. They get a little, thing. There's 6 of them on a plate. They had mounds of sushi. And I was like, I'd never seen that much sushi for my actual consumption. Just staring me in the face. And they were saying yeah, this is how Japanese people eat sushi. Lots of it. So this is like a sushi feed. But things like that, you remember them. Food comes back, And I find that meat comes back more than vegetables. I mean, it's and I think there's something very primal in that you remember the different species you've consumed in a certain sort of way. It's like I just told someone yesterday, I had to really, really, really stop myself from buying a really lovely looking piece of horse steak up in Villar yesterday in order to not eat by myself and come down and eat leftovers with you. That's how much you mean to me. But you see, but I've had actually horse steak here before, and I went and I had some other friends who were here last time I was here, and we cut it in 4 ways, and it was just this whole experience of what does this taste like? Of course, I realized for some people I've just killed flicka. But nevertheless, I mean, obviously you remember that. Part of this is also about creating a world in which is memorable. Because so much of the kind of technological behavior we indulge in is not memorable. That is to say, you can't distinguish one act of using a cell phone from another act of using a cell phone, unless, of course, the voice on the other side is saying something like, "Your father just died." Then you remember that call. But prior to that, all those other kinds of calls, or worst case scenarios, speaking about conversation, is, we used to, when I was young, we used to talk about people who actually broke up with someone using the telephone. But I've heard of people recently who broke up with someone using texting. Which is, to me, it's like, what cowards, but what abstraction, that people can no longer face each other, that they would sit there and saying things like, I don't think I could see you anymore, period. That would be the message on this little garbage-like post-it note, electronic post-it note we send to people. That would be it. That would be, I'm saying goodbye to you forever with an electronic post-it note. What is wrong with this picture? Pretty much everything. I think there ought to be real conversation involved in all the things in life, to the degree possible. Now, the truth is, though, we're dealing with people who actually are really accustomed to using technology to get away. There are people that we will have relationships with who simply cannot deal with us face to face. Or we ourselves may be like that and need to ask ourselves questions. But to get back to this feast thing, I have also learned that to do other things than just eating. So you get together and you eat, and now what? Well, you can have a good conversation that lasts all night, but you can also do other things. In New York City, when I lived there, 3 times I attempted to have very interesting different meals. One time, I got a group of people together. It was around Halloween time. I gave 2 garbage bags to my friends who were visiting. One was visiting from Texas, and the other was visiting from Oregon. They were like the special guests, but they were staying with me. I gave 2 bags to them, and I said, you guys go out into the park, which was across the street from where I live, and it was fall, and gather as many leaves as possible. You go do that. Then I had people coming over, and we had special foods and stuff, but what I did was I had them smear the leaves all over the house, which also brought a lot of insects in, but that's another story. But it was an attempt. Like, for instance, when they went into the bathroom, the bathtub was full of leaves. And I am sure, somewhere lodged in their mind, occasionally they were going, bathtub full of leaves. Oh yeah, Byrne's house. Just like this weird thing. We also all had to tell stories. And so I made the stories, like at that point, I made it basically tell something that's really important to you. And people told various kinds of stories that were important to them. The next time I did it around Christmas time. And that was also quite good. And I brought in branches, which was really difficult to find in New York City, and completely covered the inside of the living room in them. So that it was, if you walked in, it was completely green. Which had an interesting effect. At that time, people smoked a lot more in the houses than they do now in America, where everyone has to stand outside. But the smoking, there were, how in the morning after someone smoked in a room, you could always tell. You couldn't tell at all the next morning because there was so much greenery that just sucked it all up. It's just a hint for you smokers. I did another Halloween one, or not Halloween really, but around that time of year. And I told everyone to bring pumpkins and that they had to come and carve them there. And this was really fascinating because the first person came and they said, oh, I have to carve a pumpkin. Okay. And they did the standard jack-o'-lantern. Then, the next person came and said, okay. And then he did a kind of more artistic jack-o'-lantern. Then the next person came and did the Picasso jack-o'-lantern. And this went on for a while. There was about 10 people that came. Finally, my friend Greg was the last one to come. He looks around at everyone else's. There's they've increased in artistic subtlety and complexity as they've gone along. And he finally looks around, and I know him very well. He's going to make his scary. There's nothing cute going on here. He just goes, I give him a little pumpkin like this. Everyone had to bring their pumpkin. He goes away, and he goes, comes out, puts it down, and we all went, oh! And he just carved an X in it. It was brilliant. It was just totally made everyone else's pumpkin look redundant because it was so frightening. Pumpkin with an X. It felt like, ooh, this is really creepy stuff. But it was great. And then we told, of course, scary stories that evening. And those were some very ones because they varied from real psychological things that frightened people to dreams people had had to strange things they remembered. It was really fascinating. And those kinds of things, I think, they connect you to people. Now, the problem in New York City, as I discovered, is continuity. Because people seem to come and go about every 3 to 5 years. And so, between the first time I did it, there's about a year jump between these ones. So there's, I did it 1 year, skipped a year, did it another year, skipped a year, did it another year. Between the first 2 events I did, there were only 2 people that were the same as the time before. And between the second 2, there were only, I think, 1 person who was the same. And between all 3, there was no one who was there except me for all of them. Which says something about our environment today and how people come and go. And again, it's technology that provides this, and this is why I'm saying, ultimately, in order to actually do something in this world, you got to settle that. You got to, because these are good ideas, but they don't work, ultimately, if people are just drifting. And so that's one of the reasons I also moved to Alaska, because I knew I would see people live and be born, and I would see people die. And I would, you know, the older folks I've met, many of them have died since I've been there, and I've seen people born. People who were just babies when I first got there are now talking to me consciously about ideas. You know, so it's an interesting thing where you can start to have a continuity of relationships. Now, of course, there are a lot of summer people who come and go, and some decide, ooh, I really have to live in Alaska. Some just do it for a year or 2. Some stay. And I'm always glad for the ones that stay, because I'm glad to have people to add to the continuity. And I don't actually mind the people who come and go. Some of them really should go. But I think that it's a way of dealing with it. So in Alaska, of course, I've experimented as well. One of my best experiments is with the concept of games. And one of the things I've realized is that games help weld people together. I'm not talking necessarily board games, and certainly not video games, but I am talking about, although board games and card games can form a certain small, subtle community, as certain members here have discovered. Like I've told more than one person, you know, at each period at L'Abri I come and there's different things. Last time I was here, for some reason, there was like 35 people and 26 of them smoked, and I had no idea how that had happened. But this time it's kind of like, it's all these people playing cards all the time. It's like, you know, it's a very fascinating sort of, you know, how each group has its own little foibles and things. One of the things I did was, I have come to learn, actually I learned this in France originally. I was visiting France, I think it was like 1993, no, 96, visiting some friends in Poitiers. And they said, we're going to this party thing. And I said, fine, I'll come along with you. So I go there, and they're in this old farmhouse, big empty place. They had like a bench, a table with benches in it, and that's about it in the room. And people are hanging out. And then they decide to play this game. And the game is kind of like, you're blindfolded, and then you have to touch somebody. And but everyone's trying to move around you, and and there'll be some people who come really close, whisper into your ear, and you go like trying to touch them, and you can't because they're gone. And of course, one of the interesting things about that particular environment, playing this game, one of the things I remember really well was there was a walk-in fire that was going the entire time, and being French and not being like so safety conscious as Americans, was wide open. So one of the things you could do while you were blindfolded is walk straight into the fire. Of course, everyone would assume that you would feel it way before you got there, so no one knew, you know, and I actually got tagged at one point and was like walking around doing this, and I was like, oh, okay, you know, and go the other way. And, so I brought that game back to Alaska, and it was at my 50th birthday party. I decided to whip this out, and so we had about 20 or 30 people there, and I put it out on the lawn, and I put it with, like, I attached 2 hoses together, made a ring around them, and the point is, if you stand outside, if you get outside the ring, you're it, or if you get tagged, you're it. But the thing is, the hill is kind of on a slant, this big lawn, so it was really quite fascinating. And you know, there were some people who were really into trying to get people to think they were standing right there next to them and such. But it tells, those kind of things tell you much more about people than sometimes just your words do. You just learn different things about them in that kind of environment. And I find that those kinds of games, they seem like children's games, but in the past, people used to play more of these kind of games. I mean, one of the best games I ever played in my life was when I lived on these Christian communes, and it was at nighttime, and we played hide-and-go-seek with a flashlight on 7 acres of farm ground. That was just obviously memorable, you know, quite the experience, looking for people in all these farm buildings and fields with high grass and all the rest of it. I learned a lot from L'Abri, like I said. with emphasis on meals and discussions. And I've learned that discussions, finding ways of having them, is so important. Sometimes conversations just drift, and sometimes, you can spend the entire time discussing whether Spider-Man's costume was better when it was, red or black or whatever, these kinds of things. Obviously, you've done this. So, but I think there comes a point at which, how do you encourage not only yourself but your friends, the people in your environment, to have a more interesting relationship to each other, to make a world that's more memorable. A couple of words here before I skip to the last section here. I mentioned media and conversation and just being sensitive to the human beings in the environment. Not letting the TV just drift on and on when you walk in. Of course, there's nothing you can do if you enter someone else's house and their TV is just droning on and on. So then you have to rearrange your own expectations and such. But it's the same with all of your media. Think about, just don't play random music. I don't mind music as background, but if you're just playing I've got records I don't think would be appropriate for background music, including the early works of Diamanda Gallis that I was always afraid of playing when I lived in New York City, because I thought that the Polish landlady who lived directly above me would think I was having an exorcism. Probably not the best music for a conversation. But nor do you want to just necessarily have some, new age music droning on in the back that no one notices. Or you can do what I do. Okay, if I want to have people come over and watch a video, let's make it the event. Let's talk about movies. Let's talk about music if we're going to listen to music. Let's not just have it as background. Let's do it. Let's get involved with it. And that's one way of taking the media and adding conversation and making it interesting. I have thousands and thousands of records and such. CDs. Individual downloaded things which are now on hard media copies. But the truth is, none of that stuff really matters at all if it does not feed conversation. I'm not a collector. I don't care about having the first pristine edition of a book or something like this. I care about it as far as how I can take it back to others. And consider this. We do now make art in the digital world. Not only do we make art in the digital world, consider the last time anybody here took a photograph. And what sort of media was that? It was digital, no matter what it was. So now what people tend to do is put their photographs on something like Facebook and say, go get it. But whatever happened to the photo album? And why do people take so many photos? So I have a friend back in Alaska who is a Christian. He takes lots and lots of photos of community events and such. He also has children that are about 8, 9 years old, his oldest boy, and they've got children, 3 other kids. But you know what? I am absolutely sure he has at least 5,000 or more photographs, maybe 20,000, I actually come to think of it, photographs of his oldest son. And what is the meaning of that? I have no idea. How can you share that with anyone? Why would we need that many photographs of somebody? You want to know how many photographs I have of myself up until the age of 8? I think about 8, 9. That's just really fine. It's fine. And then when you see those photographs, you're like, whoa, you were young once. And here's how people tend to show me photographs. They open the back of the camera, they flip it open, and they go, oh, look. I took all these photos. And then, boom. And that's how I'm going to see their photos. I never see them in another way. They just show me that. And then they show them to me totally unfiltered. They don't show me the good photos. They show me any photo that they took. Oh, yeah, that one's kind of not so good. Oh, yeah. But it's the media that helps us with this weird behavior. Used to be, you'd go back and you'd get your film back from whoever was developing it, and you'd look at it and go like, oh man, that one wasn't so good. And And then, oh, these are kind of good. And then you'd show those, maybe you'd get them in a photo album and show them. And I would say, think about this problem. People are going to die, and they're going to have 20,000 photos on their computer, and this is going to be inherited by their children. And how much of that matters? Whereas a photo album, you can do things like put things in historical order, write under them. Someone could pick up this photo album, if you did it in a very interesting manner, and show it to someone. And it's something you can you can hand it. I've got some photo albums at home. I just hand them to people when they're interested in certain things. If someone says, yeah, so what was it like being in New York? And I hand them a photo album. And they go, whoa, this is interesting. But what I haven't shown them is all the outtakes. We've written names of stuff so that people, if just picking it up, have some sense of what they're doing. But I've tried to turn photos and things back into conversation, back into the human environment, and not just the abstract environment. And it's a tough thing to do, because we're all now tempted to take far more photographs than we really should show to anybody. You know, just how much of reality can you capture? And my thought is probably not as much as we think. Finally, let's just talk about media and the church a little bit. The presence of media has completely changed the church. There are microphones and amplifiers, which go with the rock bands or go with the worship team or whatever. There are visual aids. In my church back in Alaska, we've got a projector which has the words. You're supposed to look up and see the words up there, which I have no idea why they do that for the doxology. I mean, the doxology is like 4 lines long, and we sing it every week. So why do we need to be reminded of the words? I mean, haven't we gotten it by, you know, if you sing it every week, okay, that's 52 times a year. Yeah, well, maybe there's one person who doesn't know it, but, you know, I think they'll figure it out if they open the book and look. But no one's opening the books anymore. They're all reading. And then the white screen is a little problematic, so the pastor, who's a photographer, takes nice photos, puts some photos behind it. And after a while, I'm just looking at more entertainment. One of the reasons why they went to these kind of short praise songs and stuff was because they wanted people to know the songs because they were short and repetitious. But what's happened is we've gotten stuck with screens, so that in mega churches and stuff, you've got screens all over the place. You got screens in like the mother's room where they're taking care of the children. Someone was telling me about a church they went to. It was kind of an emerging church, and they started off by watching the clip from Blade Runner. And I'm just sitting there going, now, oh, hello, I like movies. I may like them quite a bit. I have lots of them at home. And I didn't mind when Greg played Arvo Part the other day. But then again, this was a Bible study. That is to say, the nature of the experience was a little different. But I say to myself, why would you be showing Blade Runner? Why would you be showing a movie, period, within the context of worship? And this happens in our church. Someone has like a missionary project for, you know, children in Mexico or something. And they'll show the video in the middle of the service. I'm sitting there going like, it doesn't need to happen. It just is distracting. It's just entertainment. It's either entertainment or propaganda. It is not worship. In our church, they get all these packaged Bible studies or vacation Bible school packages and such. And they're all like very commercially done, which has the problem of being, you feel it. You feel this like it's a little bit too much. I don't mind people watching series. I think the first series by Schaefer is quite nice, actually, because it's kind of clunky. I like its clunkiness. But I don't know if that's the mode that Christians should get into, that their education comes from prepackaged media. There ought to be encouragement for people to learn so that they can share with each other and have some sort of conversation about the Word and the life and the Spirit. Basically, I'm going to conclude by saying this. These have just been practical suggestions. You can think of more. I don't mean any of them to be laws. I'm not saying you know, if you don't turn off your television set when someone enters the room, you're committing a sin or anything like that. I'm just saying simply we need to think. Maybe we need a little bit of a kind of a forgotten concept of etiquette. And etiquette being just simply thinking of how your world collides with other people's worlds and how to think of them first. There is a point for doing things in a way which is different than normal. That is to say, to have special events and such. I've found ways to suggest to people that the rules in this house are different than the rules you might experience otherwise. And that's a good thing, because you're in a different environment. Therefore, you have to think about how you're going to act. Whereas in my world in Alaska, if a bunch of guides invite me to a party, I pretty much know what's going to happen. People are going to sit around drinking beer and discussing the day on the river and all this other stuff. Not that that's bad. I tell them I have a 1 in 10 policy. I'll come to 1 in 10 invitations. The rest of it, it's like, you know, it's just summer worker behavior that doesn't really add to a lot. And I have the good conversations when I often work with these people one-on-one. And then I really make good connections. And then they all want to come over. One of the things I've done over the years is had music nights or movie nights. Well, I invite them over. Someone gave me a goat, which I slaughtered in Alaska. So it was just a regular goat. It wasn't a mountain goat or anything. And I ended up with 4 haunches of it, but it was like an old, tough billy goat. And I was like, I can't eat all this. And so I pressure cooked each haunch separately and invited these guys over, figuring they will help me eat all this stuff. And sure enough, they did. And they were always like, do you have any more goat leg, Byrne? And then I ran out of goat leg, and so I went around, took a collection up from them, and then purchased a goose, and then we had goose, in the late season. But what we really did was we listened to music and talked about it. And I remember one girl came over saying, like, before we were even talking, before we were even eating, she just said this, like, this is already the best day of the whole summer. I was like, huh. Boy, I guess kind of low expectations on what the summer is. But I understood what she was saying. It was that she had had so few actual, this kind of human interaction where something seems to matter and people seem to care about something, that this for her was really surprising and interesting. So I'm just going to mention one verse here to end. And that is, this is from 1 Corinthians 7:31. I'm reading out of the New American Standard Translation. It says, and this is Paul, and there's a whole context here, and it would be interesting to discuss. But I think this section here kind of says some of the things I've been saying. That those who use the world, the things of the world, should do so as though they did not make full use of it. For the form of this world is passing away. And I think that the idea of not making full use of it, the word in Greek is katakromenoi, and it seems to mean something like using it as if it was their own. And my feeling is, as a Christian, when all the new goodies show up and you are tempted to get them, maybe stand back a bit and watch how they're used. Think about it. Don't use it to the full. Don't get every new device just because it's out there and does new spectacular things. Look at the behavior that it inspires. Now, I might be forced to get an iPhone sooner or later for the very fact that I'm noticing on this trip, people don't even travel with their laptops much anymore. As long as they have this, little thing that's not such a great computer, not such a great camera, and not such a great telephone, they will use that because it's more convenient than all of them dragging them all around together or looking for phones or whatever. But I might be forced to use it, but you know what I've done is I've watched the behavior of people so that when I do get to use it, I'll say, okay, let's put some limits on this. Let's not join the hordes of people who have this thing like attached to their hands and are just staring down at this instead of the world. Instead of seeing the world and the people and the things that God has given, that we have given ourselves, the art and the culture, the music. Instead of being separated from that, let's find a way to keep those things alive and in some cases resuscitate these things. If you have questions or anything, this is probably the point for that.
Ben, do you have any thoughts on the trade-off between sort of capturing and appreciating? So sometimes when I'm in a great place, I find myself looking through the lens of a camera, and often camera technology, you haven't got a good enough camera, you're not going to capture the light you're in anyway, and I'd have been better off just leaving it in my bag and trying to remember the scene. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on kind of...
Well, there is something to that. That is to say, sometimes we do need to leave the camera in the bag. I have nothing against good cameras. I actually used to travel around with a $20 camera I bought in New York that I loved because it was a free focus, which meant it just took everything in. It didn't really have much of a lens. And it would take widescreen shots. And you could do really fascinating things. It wouldn't give you perfect clarity, but you could walk up to someone and I could take her face and the mountains would both be in kind of equal focus. So it gave you very interesting shots. And the only reason I don't use it anymore is because of the difficulty I have in getting film in Alaska or getting anything developed. But I think what matters, I don't think photography is a problem, unless, of course, I've seen this behavior. I remember once I was stopped by a beautiful site in upstate New York on the Hudson River. My friends and I, we were moving art. We worked for an art delivery system. So we had stopped and we were taking a break. We were eating a little bit of lunch, sitting there for about 20 minutes or so. Car pulls up. People get out. It's just like, wow. Then they got back in the car and they took off. And I said, I guess they're going to see this later. And I said that to my friend. He was like, yeah. Because like they didn't stop and look at it at all. And I would say, ask yourself the reasons why you're taking the photos. Maybe you're taking the photos for artistic purposes. So in that case, you might stop and see a particular arrangement of colors or textures or shapes that really fascinates you. Yeah, go grab that thing and see, look at it a little more and ask what it is that you see about that. Although I would say, look first. Get in the habit of seeing what you're photographing. I actually didn't photograph anything the first year I was in Alaska. And a lot of people have had this experience when they come there. And I had one friend come out and brings a little camera and then it's like trying to put this one into a box. It's just like, oh, okay, what do I take a picture of? And Alaska is like that. You can go 360 and it's just like, I can't get this. I can't put it in here. And that's how I felt when I first got there. So I didn't take a lot of photos. And eventually I started to see things I could take photos of. Sometimes I take photos of abandoned cars on the side of the road because there are a lot of them in different places. Because I'm fascinated by that. But it's hard to take just photos of pretty mountains and stuff. It just, after a while, it becomes like a cliche. And I want what I'm interested in to be reflected. But I find photographs are a great way to preserve certain aspects of our memory for the future. And so if I take photos of anyone today, that is my primary goal, is to kind of get them in a typical pose that I will remember them in the future. Not as a substitute for my memory, but as an aid to it. And I would say that if you're in a situation where you say, oh, I forgot my camera, rejoice. It's just work on your memory. How do you remember places? So, yeah, that's my thought on that. Yeah.
I like what you just said there about not seeing it as a substitute for your memory, but an aid to it, and I think that can apply to all these forms of media we use as well. Like Facebook, for instance, is not a substitute to relationships, but it can be an aid, maybe even, or reading a book about something. It's an aid to understanding that something, as long as maybe keeping that in check, that it's not this substitute.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm not saying don't use this stuff. I'm simply saying ask yourself questions about it and use it wisely, which can be a challenge.
One of the dangers is when we do become so detached from reality, or from a less mediated view of reality, that we end up being unable to see it on its own. And so, what's the term, simulacra, or something like that, where we see these mountains and we go, that's just like this movie, or it's just like a picture in a calendar or something. Instead of seeing it for what it is, we're comparing it to something that's not real. Right.
Yeah, Walker Percy in his essay "Message in a Bottle" has a whole. The book is "Message in a Bottle." The essay is called "The Loss of the Creature," and he talks about just even the name Grand Canyon puts certain thoughts in your mind that when you get there, and if it doesn't look like the photos, you start to say, "Oh, it's like a cloudy day. It's like this is not quite the Grand Canyon I was expecting," and so you don't see it because he has what he calls a preformed symbol complex in your mind already about it. But yeah, it's learning to see. I mean, sometimes I think we have to take a walk. I call these my Tarkovsky walks in New York because Tarkovsky's films are very slow and just study the environment. But I would just go out into the nature and just look slowly at it without anything. That is, say, no camera, nothing. One time I was doing that. I just got about 60 yards off the road. And all of a sudden, I was just going up really quietly. And actually in Alaska, you're supposed to make some noise for various reasons. And one of them was, jumped up in front of me and ran off. And it was black and dark and big. And I was like, okay, I think that's the end of that Tarkovsky walk for the day. But, it was like, but nevertheless, just I sometimes go at different seasons into the woods when there's like lots of moss in them. And then the moss is just about to be frozen. It's just an interesting time, and just look. Or sometimes an activity, one thing I do in Alaska is mushroom hunting. And I find that as an activity really focuses you on the soil and the ground in a way you normally never see it.
I was wondering about when you were talking about having these interesting gatherings and like being really intentional. Do you think it's harder in our world as like we do move to more and more like media and cell phone communication and Facebook to like have that with people? Do you think like people have a lack in a bit? I mean, like you said, the Irish are a great conversation. Like, have we lost our ability to, in some senses, to converse?
Well, there's kind of a jokey way we have of saying that you could have an entire conversation with the word dude in America. It's like, dude. Yeah, dude. You know, and in a sense, there's something to that we have allowed our language to break down a bit. Not that we are totally... I often think the caveman is an image of the future, not the past, and that we're moving towards that. It's just like, sucks, rules. You know, it's just like, yeah. But what I have discovered, though, is that actually it's kind of like people who are starving. Actually, human beings are meant to have conversations. And the fact that they don't, or the fact that their conversations are often about things that are so trivial, that these are often media-inspired kind of trivialities, or the fact that, you know, a text message, what is that in relationship to a conversation? It's like, at best, a text message just kind of tells you I'm going to be late. You know, at worst, it's like the breakup on the text message. It's like, to me, the nightmare of all text messages, you know. So we've come, you know, to the point where we've accommodated kind of a breakdown of language. But that doesn't mean we don't want it. I mean, think about yourselves here. You know, how many of you here have just been kind of inspired by the conversations you've had, whether at meal tables or with other people who've come here, or, you know, your tutor or whatever. And that isn't to say you're, you know, on some sort of Oxford level of, you know, dialogue or anything. The truth is that we're starved, and I think it's much like a person who hasn't gotten the right nutrition, and there's probably a real good correlation here. It's like you still need your vitamins, even though you're eating French fries all day. You know, there's all sorts of other stuff you should be putting in. And your body, once it gets that other stuff, will be really, really grateful, provided you just don't have to spend one whole day where you just eat salad. You know, that kind of thing, where you go overboard and just like, I've got to correct everything. But once you start getting the proper nutrition, actually, you start, and the proper ecological environment for a human being must include good conversation of some form. You know, just, that's who we are. We are beings that form relationships through words. And we want to do that. And I've discovered in Alaska, as soon as if I'm dealing with groups of people, they follow group behavior. But as soon as I get them alone, they go back to human behavior. You know? And so I find that to be really something, that's what I kind of live for, is the individual dialogues.
I have a question about your view of leisure.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, as far as kind of like the fancy realms of leisure that we engage in, like the TV shows and, you know, the novels we read and stuff that is completely, you know, or pretty much removed from reality, and it's these fantasy realms. Do you see any value in that? Apart from, because you talked about bringing things back to human relationships and stuff, but is there anything in just personal enjoyment of these things?
I think a great deal.
Is it in any sense like inferior to the person who gets enjoyment from going out on a walk in nature and like throwing pebbles in a creek? Like, is it like...
I don't know if you can compare experiences like that. I think, you know, I've gotten a great deal out of novels or out of movies. I mean, I remember the first time I saw Andrei Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev. I was at a small theater in New York City that was at 96th Street. I got out and started walking, and sometime around 42nd Street, I stopped and got to a phone and said, "You wouldn't believe the movie I just saw." But it took me from then till then to just even begin the process. It's a fantastic experience, and it related to me in personal ways. So, but I think they are part of a conversation. You know, why would you write? I mean, as someone who's been working on novels and stuff, I can tell you the person didn't just wake up one day and write it, just like dash off a few words. It's a lot of hard work, and what's the point? The point is to have someone else read it, and what's the point? To get some of the stuff you see out of your head so someone else can see it. And then let's discuss it. Now, it might happen in a book review, or it might happen in, someone says, "Ooh, this really meant something to me," and they meet you on the street or something. But I think all of that is valuable. But there's just value in sitting and reading, and just value in sitting and painting, just value in watching a movie. What I'm saying is, though, that we have the ability to have such mediated experiences to such a far degree, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the video game or wrong with the text message or something. It's just, how do we put these things back in its place and give the reality we all must occupy, the natural world we all must occupy, the social realm we all must occupy, its due. And that's what I'm saying. But I'm not saying there's anything wrong. What's wrong is when those things, I mean, I know people who, well, for instance, there are books that are read just to be consumed and then thrown away. Those books I would have a problem with. And the only way I know what those books are is by watching people reading. I would say I don't have a standard in my mind where it says all romance novels must be crap because they are about romance, I would say that my standard of why romance novels are problematic is because of the nature of the way I see them being consumed. That is to say, I see very little good consumption. I have never had a good conversation with anyone about the events taking place in certain kinds of romance novels where they came up to me afterwards, "You got to hear this book I just read." And so that gives me a little bit of a clue. And I've actually looked. I have wanted someone to tell me the meaning of romance novels. It's something I've gone back and forth for ages. And the most I can see is that they kind of feed a personal sandcastle you're building. But like a sandcastle, they fall apart really easily too. They don't really enter reality. I think classic romance novels like Jane Eyre or Charlotte the Bronte sisters or even Jane Austen stuff, that's a whole different category. But I'm talking about the kind that are just churned out. And there's billions of them. I read horror stories, and I would admit there's certain categories of horror stories which are just churned out and aren't particularly meaningful. There are others that are quite interesting indeed. So horror, I've decided, there's a good kind of horror. It's just sci-fi. It's the same way. There's some really good stuff, and then there's some stuff that's just churned out for people who just can't stop reading. And C.S. Lewis in his book An Experiment in Criticism discusses this whole issue. But he basically says that he never judges the book. He always judges the kind of reading it invites. And so I don't have any particular thing against any book. I'm always, like I say, I'm really open for the person who comes to me and says, "You should read all the Barbara Cartland books." She wrote something like, I don't know, 1,000 or so. And she would dictate them while sitting with her lapdog. These romance novels, but and tell me the themes and what's going on in there. But I've never heard that discussion. Not with me. But maybe they're having those discussions in romance conventions or something. I don't know. I wouldn't want to judge, but I'm just saying I'm waiting to hear some reports from that front. Maybe some of you can do it one day. Okay, before I go, I'm going to try to leave on the 12:30-ish bus. There are a couple things. One, if you want to stay in touch, even if I didn't talk too much, go ahead and give me your email address. And mine is really simple. I have an antique account. I'm told in some places there are people who say, "Really? You have Hotmail?" It's like, It used to be. I remember when Hotmail first came out, people would say, "Oh, you have Hotmail." It's like, ooh, what's that being used for? But now, no one says anything like that. The second thing I want is I want everyone to stand over here so I can get a photo of them. So just over this way. I think the sun will be better. Open a couple more of those curtains.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.